A fresh torrent of horror engulfed the UK during the early 1980s as the nation fell under the spell of a shiny new home technology which, according to the mainstream press, was on track to fast forward us all into a cesspit of deprivation. The swelling popularity of the domestic video cassette recorder had spawned a thriving new market for videocassette rentals on every street corner. But an unusual set of circumstances had posed a few challenges for this new breed of entrepreneurial pioneers who were forced to dig deep in order to fill up their shelves in this wild and completely unregulated industry. And this led to the unexpected rise of the video nasty. The Daily Mail was just one of many newspapers to raise awareness of how more and more children were becoming videoholics as their impressionable minds were being taken over by sickening and grotesque content which was turning them all into animals. The newspaper demanded to know, how much longer will the government dither and Parliament blather while our children can continue to buy sadism from video pushers as easily and almost as cheaply as they can buy fruit gums from the sweetie shop? Are we insane? Are we bent on rotting our own society from within? Fortunately, help was at hand in the shape of a 72-year-old moral crusader with a track record for tackling filth and clamping down on fun. But as ever, the truth can often be stranger than even the freakiest and most frightful fiction. This is the story of the UK censorship panic in which store owners lived in fear of getting raided by the police and dragged into court for trying to rent out a horror movie, even though the police didn't always seem to know what they were supposed to be looking for. It's a story which begs questions over who exactly decides what we're allowed to see and how these decisions are made. A story in which a prudish, old-aged pensioner and a few Conservative MPs somehow managed to trample all over the booming home video market with practically no opposition. A story in which the press and the politicians presented a distorted picture of reality, which was perhaps even more disturbing than the content that they were complaining about. And it's a story of hidden political agendas in which film producers, distributors, and video rental stores ultimately may have paid the price for something that had nothing whatsoever to do with them. Let's rewind right back to the beginning, and viewer discretion is advised unless such a decision has already been made on your behalf by people who know better. The very first home video recorders, or VCRs, hit the UK in the early 1970s, but they took a little while to catch on, largely because the price of the units were so hideously expensive that they were way beyond the budget of an average family household, and there wasn't really that much available to watch on them anyway. The price had dropped considerably though by the early 1980s, and around 20% of UK households had invested in a funky new VCR by 1983. And for those of you like me who are far too young and pretty to remember that far back, it's quite difficult to comprehend just how exciting it was for those people fortunate enough to have a big clunky VCR whirring away to itself next to the TV. For the best part of 20 years, the viewing habits of the UK population had been limited to just 3 terrestrial channels, and if you didn't want to miss an episode of your favourite show, you usually had to make sure that you tuned in during its one and only broadcast. But the rise of the VCR meant that you could now record your favourite shows whilst you were getting hammered in the pub, and then rewatch them as many times as you like, or at least until the VHS cassette cooked out. But whenever there was nothing decent showing on the limited options of terrestrial telly, the VCR also opened up a vast new library of alternative titles that you could rent out at your local corner shop for the price of a pot noodle. However, there were a few surprisingly odd elements relating to the choice of video cassettes on offer at the local video store. The first thing to bear in mind is that there was practically no regulation in place for films released on video. This was in sharp contrast to any movie shown in cinemas, which, since 1912, had to be approved by the British Board of Film Censors and awarded an appropriate certification such as PG or 18. This wasn't always a smooth process, and the BBFC would often demand extensive cuts and edits from the distributors in order to meet the criteria for the desired certification. In more extreme cases, including 1932 film Freaks and the 1974 slasher The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the BBFC would refuse to award even an 18 certificate, effectively banning those movies from being shown in British cinemas. But there was no such rule in place yet for content released on video cassettes, as the new technology had kind of caught the authorities off guard, even though they'd already had a decade to chew it over. This doesn't necessarily mean that it was perfectly acceptable to release anything at all on video. The new format would still have come under scrutiny from the 1959 Obscene Publications Act, and this would have helped keep the shelves clean from, say, hardcore pornography. There was no way that little Timmy could get sent to the corner shop to pick up a bag of Spanish onions, a jar of marmalade, a sherbet dip, and a copy of Bouncy Sex Vixens Go Wild on Skegness Pier. But as a simple horror movie was deemed unlikely to fall into the category of obscene, this meant that edgy titles from around the world could get slapped onto video without any draconian film censors sticking their noses in and demanding cuts. This leads us into another very unusual point about the choice of movies that you were able to rent in the early 1980s. You might assume this was a period in which viewers could rent relatively recent blockbuster movies or vintage classics for the first time, but in fact, many of the major distributors took quite some time to get on board with the idea of releasing stuff on VHS, largely down to concerns over the simplicity of piracy. The fear was that once a big movie had been let loose in the wild on VHS, every cassette would end up spawning thousands of pirated copies, and the film in question would never rake in profits ever again. So, if you were hoping to rent a copy of E.T. or The Empire Strikes Back, you'd be bang out of luck. You wouldn't even be able to rent a copy of Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, or pretty much anything ever produced by Disney. So, this left rental stores in something of a quandary. They had lines of excited new customers queuing up to spend money on renting video cassettes, but couldn't provide them with anything they really wanted to watch, or something that they might at least be familiar with. But this had also opened up an opportunity for smaller distributors to provide the rental stores with something a little different. Who needs E.T. or Citizen Kane when you can instead choose from a deeply obscure new range of low-budget imports from Italy and the US? Yes, the British video rental store was now heaving with an eclectic mix of grisly horrors, slashers, and exploitation movies, which you were never likely to see if you stopped in for the night and watched ITV. This was a whole new, thrilling arena of ketchup blood, sliced appendages, squashed heads, zombies, shocking violence, a splash of gratuitous nudity, and a big dollop of cannibalism. The video nasty had landed. Many of these films had been refused a certificate by the British Board of Film Censors, whilst others had never been submitted to the BBFC in the first place on the grounds that it would have been a complete waste of effort even trying. Either way, it was very likely that this was going to be your first opportunity to sample most of these films in the UK, and all it took now was a trip to the local shop. It might have taken you a while to take your pick, as there was no shortage of material, ranging from comically cheap and laughably terrible imports to movies that promised a lot more than they delivered, to films that are now held in high regard by certain connoisseurs. Wes Craven's debut, The Last House on the Left, from 1972, is an example of the latter. There are no traditional monsters in this flick, aside from the sick gang of fugitives who brutally assault and then murder two teenage girls, but then find themselves facing consequences from the revenge-seeking parents of one of the victims. Now regarded as an intriguing debut film from a prolific award-winning director, it was denied a cinema release in the UK after the BBFC declared that they could find no redeeming merit within the piece. But the BBFC had no say whatsoever in whether the film should be allowed to make it onto video shelves. There's a similar revenge theme running throughout the 1978 film I Spit on Your Grave, in which a young female writer is assaulted by a gang of sadistic men, but then she later exacts her own vengeance on each member of the gang in ridiculously violent ways. Banned in various countries for its depiction of graphic violence and a sequence of sexual assault which runs for 30 minutes, this one was never even submitted to the BBFC, but found a new audience in the unregulated video industry just a few years later. I Spit on Your Grave is still very much a divisive film today, with some arguing that it's a feminist piece which purposefully depicts the raw, prolonged bleakness of sexual assault, whilst others are of the opinion that it's one of the worst and most vile films in history. Then we have the 1980 Italian film Cannibal Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato, which was certainly a highly influential piece, as the found footage format clearly inspired the Blair Witch Project nearly 20 years later. In this case, the footage relates to a group of American filmmakers who travel to the Amazon rainforest to document indigenous tribes who are supposedly cannibals, but it turns out that the filmmakers were possibly more primitive and savage than the tribes that they were filming. It's a deeply uncomfortable watch, depicting realistic graphic violence, sexual assault, and most disturbing of all, genuine cruelty to animals, including a turtle, a squirrel monkey, and a pig. And the jury's out on whether this is a meaningful examination of American exploitation of indigenous cultures and the moral compass of journalists, or if it's just a relentless barrage of repulsive material. Cannibal Holocaust felt so realistic that it led to claims that it was a genuine snuff movie in which the cast were unwittingly murdered by the filmmakers. This in turn led to some long-running myths about the film, which are still falsely reported today, partly nudged along by the director himself. The legend goes that the cast were never seen again for a year after the film was released, and that the producers were charged with their murders. The director, Ruggero Deodato, admitted that he had got the cast to sign contracts which precluded them from undertaking any public or commercial work for a year in order to help fuel rumours that the events depicted in the movie were genuine and that they really had all been killed on screen. He reportedly had to wheel out cast members in court to prove that he hadn't actually killed them. In fact, though, barely any of that is true at all. Whilst Ruggero Deodato helped perpetuate the myth that he'd asked the cast to sign such contracts, one of them denied this, whilst others clearly popped up in other films shortly after the release of Cannibal Holocaust. He was never charged with murder, and the authorities never truly believed that he directed a genuine snuff movie. It is true, though, that the film was confiscated by Italian authorities shortly after its premiere in Milan, and that Ruggero Deodato, along with the screenwriter and 3 producers, were found guilty of obscenity and animal cruelty charges, each receiving a suspended 4-month prison sentence. Yet, only a slightly edited version of the original film still landed on the UK shelves just a couple of years later. If all this material sounds a bit too heavy and disturbing, there were plenty of other video nasties that were far less extreme in nature, focusing more on excessive buckets of blood and gore, which were way too unrealistic to take seriously on any level. But this does raise the question of what exactly constitutes a video nasty. Some consider it to be a perfectly legitimate and wide-ranging genre of horror, which could potentially include zombie bloodbaths, Nazi sexploitation films, serial killer slashers, or even just a particularly sinister psychological thriller. But others believe that it specifically refers to an official list of 72 films that was later drawn up by the Director of Public Prosecutions in 1983. This was the infamous list of banned films, which were deemed to be potentially in breach of the 1959 Obscure Publications Act. However, the Conservative MP Graham Bright had his own ideas about the definition of a video nasty. He said, "Mutilations of bodies, cannibalism, gang sexual assault, that's what a video nasty is." We'll hear a lot more about that official banned list and Graham Bright in a moment or two, but we're already in confusing territory here, as many of the nasties on the list don't necessarily fit in with the simplistic explanation offered up by the Conservative MP. And it seems that a video nasty could mean very different things to different people. Perhaps we don't need to get too bogged down with the content of the films anyways. It could be argued that it was part of the packaging and the matching print advertisements that played a bigger role in sparking the imminent controversy rather than the actual films themselves. In fact, the distributors may have only had themselves to blame for what came next, as it was their own slightly nutty marketing strategies that first landed them in hot water. The vivid artwork of the covers was more gruesome and shocking than anything found in the film quite a lot of the time. And this frequently led to profound disappointment for the adventurous horror film hunter who'd been drawn in by the garish, blood-curdling scenes explicitly depicted on the cover, only to find that the actual film was closer in tone to a children's puppet show. Yes, it could feel like a bit of a swizz, but there was a bigger problem when the genuinely graphic film was marketed with imagery that was actually quite authentic. The cover of the tasteless 1976 exploitation film SS Experiment Camp featured an image depicting a topless woman being crucified upside down with a swastika hanging from her wrist, which was just the kind of thing you could expect to endure in the film. This cover appeared in the magazine of advertisements and generated a flood of complaints. The pretty lame defence from the distributors was that they had already censored the cover to some degree by adding a pair of knickers to the crucified woman, which weren't in there in the original image. There was an even bigger outcry following the magazine advertisements for the 1979 video Driller Killer. The cover and the full-page advertisement depicted a photographic still of one of the most disturbing scenes in the film by far, in which a man screams in agony as the protagonist plunges a drill into his forehead and rivers of blood spurt and flow all down from the victim's face. Might seem like a bit of an odd way to give away the most grisly segment of a movie on the front cover, but it also felt as if the distributors were giving away something a lot more costly in the long term. For a couple of years, these releases had been more or less quietly bubbling under the radar, enjoyed by the new VCR enthusiasts who were actively seeking them out. We'd be very surprised if any moral crusader or Conservative MP was even aware that they could rent a copy of Driller Killer from their local shop if they ever fancied a bit of change from Des O'Connor tonight. It was naturally in the interests of the distributors to raise more awareness of their new titles in attention-grabbing ways, but in doing so, they were always arousing the interest of exactly the wrong sort of crowd. The complaints from these advertisements were upheld by the Advertising Standards Authority, but there was worse to come. Some bright spark at the distributor Go Video thought it would be a jolly promotional wheeze to write a fake letter of complaint about one of their own titles, Cannibal Holocaust. The letter purported to have been penned by a concerned viewer who felt that this kind of depraved filth should be banned immediately, and it was sent to Mary Whitehouse of the National Viewers and Listeners Association. It was an idea that backfired spectacularly. Mary Whitehouse had been a full-time professional complainer for the best part of 2 decades by this point. The self-appointed guardian of decency and moral purity founded the National Viewers and Listeners Association in 1965, which is still going strong today under the name of Media Watch UK. Although the organisation was relatively tiny, it was literally run by Whitehouse and a few of her cronies, there was clearly some support for her ambition to send us all hurtling back to the Victorian era, as her Clean Up TV campaign in the 1960s garnered over 500,000 signatures, which is no mean feat back in the pre-internet days. It would seem that the devout Christian was strongly opposed to the social and political changes in British society during that swinging decade, and she felt that modern television was encouraging an unwelcome rise in permissiveness. She strongly objected to any TV show which included hints of nudity, bad language, violence, blasphemy, or indeed anything at all which rode against her traditional, or some might say outdated, beliefs. Whitehouse spent most of her time writing furious letters of complaint to MPs, TV studios, radio stations, and anyone who would listen. It reached the point where she got so annoying that most of her letters went unanswered, and they developed a tendency to mysteriously go missing in the post. But she did score some notable victories over the years, as she set her sights on targets such as Benny Hill, Alf Garnett, and anything ever written by the celebrated boundary-pushing screenwriter Dennis Potter. During the mid-1970s, she had effectively destroyed a golden age of Doctor Who, which she branded tea time brutality for tots. Her complaints led to an apology from the BBC Director General, the removal of probably the greatest producer that Doctor Who ever had, and the watering down of the show, which practically became light entertainment over the next few years. But she also experienced plenty of embarrassing failures. She failed in her campaign to get the BBC to ban songs such as My Ding-a-Ling by Chuck Berry and School's Out by Alice Cooper, the latter of whom reportedly sent her a bunch of flowers, as he believed that the publicity from her complaints had helped the single get to #1 in the UK charts. It's understandable why Whitehouse wouldn't have approved of the supposed anti-school sentiments of the song, as she used to be a teacher herself before she gave it up to become a full-time campaigner. Believe it or not, she actually used to be a sex education teacher, so let's spare a thought for the poor souls stuck in those classes. She also failed her private prosecution against the director of a 1982 theatre production entitled The Romans in Britain, in which he believed that an erect penis could be glimpsed at one point. This wasn't true at all, but Whitehouse couldn't have actually known this because she'd never seen the play herself. On a similar note, it sounds as if she never bothered to watch Cannibal Holocaust or any other horror title that was now making her blood boil following the fake letter of complaint from Go Video. She even admitted this during an interview on TV-AM with Nick Owen when she declared, "I have never seen a video nasty. I actually don't need to see visually what I know is in that film." But her refusal to watch the movies wasn't in any way going to diminish her determination to get rid of them. And the point is that her fresh crusade against these videos was kicked into gear by one of the distributors pretending to be outraged by their own film. Go Video may have been taking inspiration from the success of School's Out when they came up with this cunning strategy, and they figured that Mary Whitehouse was only going to provide them with piles of publicity. The tactic may even have worked to a certain extent, but it also unleashed a monster that was set to devour the whole industry. It's often reported that it was Mary Whitehouse herself who came up with the name video nasty, but we don't believe that she can take the credit here. It's an unusual term because it was warmly braced by both sides of the battle. The moral crusaders treated it as a derogatory name for its vile content, whilst the fans proudly treated it as a cool name that described the kind of stuff they enjoyed watching. Some have even suggested that it was the video industry itself that came up with the term, although it seems more likely that it was first coined by journalist Peter Chippendale in a scathing article that ran in the Sunday Times in 1982. Now that Mary Whitehouse had brought the matter to wider public attention by giving interviews to the press, gaining the support of politicians, and regularly appearing on television to announce the film she'd never seen, swathes of the UK press began to show strong support for her campaign, and they pulled no punches in what they perceived to be the effect of this terrifying new trend in the video rental market. The Daily Star was one of the first newspapers to report on the apparent crisis in May 1982, when they claimed that young children were being exposed to some of the most horrific and violent films ever made. The paper also interviewed James Furman, the director of the British Board of Film Censors, who vented his fury over how the video distributors were not being made to bow down before his board's authority. The Daily Mail went several steps further when they made the sensational claim that the minds of our children were being taken over by video sadism. They compared this new brand of young videoholics to drug addicts who were simply gorging themselves silly on scenes of torture and depravity. The paper also drew connections between video nasties and rising crime rates in the UK, and eventually felt compelled to launch its own campaign to stomp out this new evil for good. As they put it, "We need censorship at the moment as we have never needed it before. And if video censorship of the most stringent kind isn't brought in pretty damned quick, we're going to have an upsurge in violence and terror and abuse in our land and homes, the likes of which we never suspected in our wildest terror." To help back up their arguments, the press also wheeled out several recent criminal cases which were said, but certainly never proven, to be inspired by certain video nasties. One such was that of an 18-year-old named Martin Austin, who was found guilty of sexual assault, burglary and theft in 1983. He claimed that he first formed the plan for the sexual assault after watching I Spit on Your Grave. The judge agreed that the film may have helped to inflame his mind, although no liability or responsibility was ever placed on the filmmakers or distributors. Let's not remember either how things went for the assaulters in that film. A much less convincing case was that of 23-year-old Frank Mottershed, who in 1982 was found guilty of murdering his friend. Mottershed claimed that he'd been watching Driller Killer the night before the murder, and he believed he was dreaming when he carried out the attack. Whilst the Daily Mirror pounced on this story as further proof that video nasties were turning perfectly good people into ruthless murderers, the truth is that Mottershed was suffering from acute mental issues, and it's believed that the whole driller-killer angle was a strategic move from the defence to shift the blame during this convenient media storm. But it was a media storm that was now attracting sympathy and support from influential figures and politicians. Peter Kruger was the operational head of Scotland Yard's Obscene Publications Squad at the time, and he was clearly coming round to the idea that his department had a duty to get involved in this situation, as he put it. "The nasties could play a part in the general spread of violence. We have come across murders of such horrible, perverted a nature that the perpetrators must have gotten it from somewhere." And it was also beginning to draw support from the incumbent Conservative Party, who would shortly be battling for their seats during the next general election. The early 1980s had indeed been a tough time for the UK, as the nation faced mass unemployment, race riots, miners' strikes, recession, a conflict in the Falklands, an AIDS epidemic, endless new singles from Cliff Richard, and a very real significant rise in crime rates. Critics of the Conservative government felt that it may have been useful to tackle the roots of all social problems that were pervading the UK, but instead they took the lazier option of following the advice of Mary Whitehouse and pinning all the blame on horror movies, as they were clearly responsible for everything. An interesting point here is that surprisingly few people bothered to speak up in defence of video nasty or point out that maybe the UK's problems ran a little deeper than a small store renting out copies of Flesh for Frankenstein, Prisoner of the Cannibal God, and The Witch Who Came from the Sea. Perhaps the whole genre was seen as a little too trashy and sleazy to muster any serious motivation for fighting back. Even the distributors didn't really do a good job of arguing their case. Peter Chippendale's 1982 article in the Sunday Times went under the title of "How High Street Horror is Invading the Home" and featured a brief interview with Mike Baer, the head of Astra Video, who were distributing such titles as I Spit on Your Grave. When asked if the authorities should intervene in the unregulated video industry, Mike Baer gave a surprisingly cocky answer. "There's no censorship law on video at all. What can they do about it?" It sounded as if the head of Astra Video was actively goading the authorities into taking action, and that's almost as bad an idea as writing a letter of complaint to Mary Whitehouse about one of your own videos. To hit the pause button for just a second though, it's worth considering why the video nasty scandal was so unique to the UK, and why the rise of the VCR didn't seem to spark the same levels of concern and outrage in, say, the US? Well, in the case of the US, this could partially be explained by the fact that it took longer for the VCR to take off in the States, where cable television was already offering a wider choice for viewers without the need to get up off the sofa and pop to the shops. But it's also because the US was generally a lot less uptight about horror films and didn't get too hot under the collar about blood and gore. It's an entirely different story over there with nudity, of course. A brief and very minor wardrobe malfunction during the Super Bowl halftime performance will send the whole nation into a meltdown, but severed heads, flesh-eating zombies, flailing entrails, and chainsaw attacks are all perfectly fine and dandy as long as nobody flashes a nipple. The moral crusaders of the US were also way too busy focusing their attention on different targets such as heavy metal. Whilst Mary Whitehouse was foaming at the mouth about video nasties, evangelical Christians in the US were playing records backwards to try and decipher the hidden satanic messages. But the UK censorship panic wasn't really replicated anywhere else in the world at all. This was partly because most other countries were quicker to put regulations in place, but it was also because mass hysteria inflated by the press just seems to be a distinctively British method of going about things, whereas other corners of the globe took a much more chilled out approach without ever once suggesting that videos were taking over the minds of their children. A further point to make here is that nobody in the UK was complaining about British films. With a couple of exceptions, every film deemed to be a video nasty was either an Italian or an American production. So it felt as if the campaigners had no beef with the British horror film industry, which had been dominated by Hammer for the past couple of decades. There was nothing wrong with that at all. It was just all this primitive foreign filth landing on our shores that we had to protect our children from. Hammer's Lust for a Vampire was perfectly acceptable, but an Italian film called Killer Nun would be enough to get Mary Whitehouse reaching out for her quill and parchment in rage. You'd think that Mary Whitehouse might have approved of a Channel 4 documentary entitled A Gentleman's Agreement, which was scheduled for broadcast in May 1983. The documentary took a look at the video nasty saga from a feminist perspective and made the point that a male-dominated industry was profiting from the production of films which often depicted women as the targets of graphic violence and torture. But no, Whitehouse was not happy at all when she learned that the documentary planned to show short clips from films such as I Spit on Your Grave and SS Experiment Camp, even if it was to help illustrate the whole point that they were trying to make. Whitehouse was so incensed by this that she called on the Independent Broadcasting Authority to review the documentary and pull it from the schedules on the grounds that it would be a criminal offence to broadcast such material on television. It was another failed effort, as the IBA ruled that there was no reason why Channel 4 shouldn't be allowed to go ahead with the transmission. Here's a funny thing though, literally just a few months later, Whitehouse bagged an invitation to the Conservative Party conference, at which she put on a fun little video presentation for a gang of concerned Tory MPs. The presentation consisted of a series of the most violent and disturbing clips pulled from what she considered to be the worst offenders on the video shelf. An enthusiast of the genre might have appreciated the effort that she'd gone into making a compilation of all the best bits, but we're guessing that no buckets of popcorn were being passed around during this particular presentation. Considering that Whitehouse had consistently claimed that she'd never seen any of these videos, it does make you wonder how she went about preparing the compilation. But more to the point, it does seem strange how Whitehouse was angrily protesting about the screening of such clips on Channel 4, yet was perfectly happy to host her own private greatest hits of horror presentation. We can only assume she felt that privately educated Conservative MPs were in a stronger mental position to absorb such material than people who might live on council estates. Having said that, the Conservative MP, Graham Bright, was watching the presentation and he was not privately educated. Nonetheless, he was the one who felt most compelled to fight for the cause alongside of his new comrade, Mary Whitehouse, and lead the government charge against video nasties. And he sounds like just the kind of sensible and logical guy who knows exactly what he was talking about, or maybe not. During a live televised interview, he gave the somber warning to his viewers that research is taking place and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe dogs as well. Video nasties weren't just coming after your children, they were coming after your pooches too. Research was indeed taking place, but as far as we can make out, no dogs were invited to participate in the discussion at this stage. Instead, a team from Oxford Polytechnic, led by Dr. Clifford Hill, began working on a report which had been commissioned by an organisation known as the Parliamentary Group Video Inquiry. That's quite a grand name, but in fact it had nothing to do with Parliament at all. It was an entirely independent group set up by a few influential figures, including our old chum, Mary Whitehouse. The researchers in the team got busy interviewing school children and law enforcement officers to build a clearer picture of how video violence was having a negative impact on children in particular, and the conclusions were jaw-dropping. The study found that 40% of children below the age of 7 had watched a video nasty, and Dr. Clifford Hill rounded off the report by warning that a time bomb of violence was set to explode on the streets of Britain unless there was an intervention. The press jumped on these findings as further proof that the video sadism was turning our children into a generation of ghouls, with the Daily Mail adopting a particularly smug tone as it reminded readers that it had been leading the way in the campaign against the nasties all along. But let's just rewind a second and take a closer look at that report. How credible was it? Well, it does seem quite incredible that 40% of kids under the age of 7 could have seen such an explicit horror film, especially as only 20% of households ever even owned a VCR at the time. Critics of the report have suggested that it was rushed, poorly gathered, and was more of an opinion piece than a comprehensive study. We do have to bear in mind that the researchers have been commissioned by an entirely non-parliamentary group headed by the likes of Mary Whitehouse, who only wanted to hear a very specific outcome. But here's the point that really shatters any faint flicker of credibility. The communications researcher, Guy Cumberbatch, was one of many who felt very dubious about the findings of the report, and he managed to get his hands on the questionnaire that the researchers had handed out to the kids. It was a 6-page list consisting of 116 titles of video nasties, and the children were required to go through the list and put a tick next to every title that they'd seen. Straight away, we might be able to detect a few problems here. If all your young mates are boasting that they've seen some of these video nasties, are you really going to be the square of the classroom who hasn't seen any? Are you really going to leave those 6 pages entirely blank, or are you going to start considering putting a tick next to some of the titles that sound the most interesting? Guy Cumberbatch decided to put his theory to test with quite brilliant ingenuity. He made a few crucial revisions to the questionnaire and handed it out to several classrooms of young school children. Well, actually, the revisions were quite substantial. He replaced all the genuine titles on the list with film titles that he just completely made up, and the results were interesting, to say the least. Over 2/3 of the kids claimed to have seen a bunch of horror films that never actually existed. Funnily enough, the press didn't seem particularly interested in this, and they continued to push forward the conclusions of the original report as if it was concrete proof, when it clearly wasn't. Whilst everyone was waiting to see how the government would respond to the exceedingly dodgy data, the Obscene Publications Squad and a handful of zealous police forces had already leapt into action by swooping down on video stores and distributors with the only legislation they currently had at their disposal: the 1959 Obscene Publications Act. The Greater Manchester Police Force took a particularly heavy-handed approach as they raided stores across the country, seized tapes, and sought prosecutions against the evil purveyors of filth. Their devotion to the cause may have had something to do with the fact that the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester was James Anderton, a devout Christian, anti-pornography crusader, and most likely a member of Mary Whitehouse's Monday Morning Coffee Club. These early police raids did lead to a few notable prosecutions, but only under the relatively mild Section 3 of the Act, which demanded nothing more than the forfeiture of the offending tapes. The first victim was Driller Killer. 590 copies of these were seized along with the master tapes. I Spit on Your Grave was another early casualty after the distributors Astra Video were ordered to hand over 234 copies of the film for destruction. Whilst Mary Whitehouse welcomed these prosecutions, she also expressed disappointment that distributors were not being charged under the more severe Section 2 of the Act, which could have led to a maximum prison sentence of 3 years for anyone found guilty of distributing the video. But there were issues here with the vagueness of the 1959 Obscene Publications Act and how it related to a horror film. According to the Act, obscenity is defined as material which may tend to deprave and corrupt persons who are likely, having regard to all relevant circumstances, to read, see, or hear the matter contained or embodied in it. But a later amendment also stated that a crime has not been committed if it could be proven that the material is justified as being for the interests of science, literature, art, or learning, or of other objects of general concern. So, when it comes to a simple horror film produced for entertainment purposes, this definition isn't entirely helpful, and different juries could reach very different verdicts. Would it really be fair to say that the relatively silly 1975 Spanish film The Werewolf and Yeti was likely to corrupt or deprave anyone who watched it? An elderly person who'd never seen anything more daring than Last of the Summer Wine might think so, but a younger person with a passion for modern cinema might just shrug and wonder why this was even being discussed in court. Even so, Tapes of The Werewolf and the Yeti were being seized and prosecutions sought. The actual raids were also proving to be quite problematic and long-winded for the police. How were they even supposed to know which tapes to seize? Were they supposed to make a quick judgment call based on the titles and the covers? Were they supposed to sit down and watch every tape they found? Perhaps they could just get Mary Whitehouse on the blower, as she seemed to be the expert on this. Or maybe they could just seize anything at all that sounded even faintly suspicious. Chief Constable James Alderton and his gang of merry men appeared to adopt the latter strategy, and this inevitably led to more than a few embarrassing blunders. They seized copies of Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now for reasons known only to themselves. They seized copies of the 1981 family comedy The Devil and Max Devlin, starring Bill Cosby and Elliot Gould, presumably because they thought it might be satanic propaganda. They seized copies of the 1982 musical comedy The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, starring Dolly Parton and Burt Reynolds, seemingly going on the title alone rather than bothering to flip the cover and take a look at the blurb on the back. And then they seized copies of an acclaimed 1980 epic war drama, which was titled after the nickname of the US Army's 1st Infantry Division. The police clearly didn't like the sound of The Big Red One. It's no surprise that the Video Retailers Association was starting to get a bit wound up about all this. Rental store owners no longer felt confident in their own stock, and they had no idea what was likely to be deemed an illegal video nasty during a random police raid. Even the most conscientious and law-abiding business owner was living in fear of a police raid, which could lead them to getting arrested for daring to have a copy of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang on the shelf. The Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Thomas Hetherington, responded to a request for more clarity from the Video Retail Associations by putting together a list of films which were deemed to be in potential breach of the Obscene Publications Act. This is often considered to be the official list of video nasties or banned films, although it was commonly referred to as the DPP list. No less than 72 films appeared on the main list, which was constantly updated to reflect successful or failed prosecutions. 39 of these titles ended up in Section 1 of the list, which meant that seizure of these films had eventually led to a successful prosecution. This section included such titles as Driller Killer, Cannibal Holocaust, I Spit on Your Grave, and Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, which were all now officially deemed to be criminally obscene and banned from distribution in their current form. The other 33 films forming Section 2 on the list were still technically liable for seizure and prosecution, but this was unlikely to be pursued after previous prosecutions had failed to secure a successful conviction. Many of these titles would eventually be bumped down to a supplementary list of 82 titles known as Section 3. Prosecutions were completely off the menu for Section 3 films, but they could still be seized and destroyed. So this DPP list was meant to clear everything up once and for all and ensure the police raids set their sights on the right titles instead of getting hopelessly lost in the children's section. But it was a very odd list, and assuming that the Director of Public Prosecutions wasn't working alone on this, we're not sure who was making the calls and what specific criteria there was. Some film titles were conspicuous by their absence, whilst Flesh for Frankenstein made the list. The follow-up, Blood for Dracula, didn't get a mention, despite featuring similarly explicit levels of violence, gore, and dismemberment. And yet the DPP list contained such oddities as I Miss You, Hugs and Kisses, which does contain mildly nasty scenes, but it's essentially quite a dull and plodding courtroom drama. It also included the 1981 psychological thriller Possession, starring Sam Neill, which had actually been granted a cinema release in the UK before it was even labelled a video nasty. Again, this includes a few surreal, nightmarish scenes, but it's largely just an intriguing art house domestic drama, which has since achieved a cult following. The ban wasn't good news for the distributor VTC either, as it killed the film and destroyed their plans for generating profits from the video rental market. They received no reply when they wrote to Scotland Yard inquiring why on earth Possession was on the banned list, and were later taken aback when 687 copies of it were seized by the police. The film was eventually released uncut on VHS in 1999. Then you have the infamous Driller Killer, which caused such a furore with the ghastly packaging and marketing. Yes, the cover depicted the most graphic scene in the film by far, but if you were expecting a whole movie devoted to a man drilling holes in the heads of his unfortunate victims, you'd be in for a massive disappointment. The film is actually more of a grimy, downbeat story of alienation, frustration, and despair, as a struggling artist begins to lose his grip on reality and eventually resorts to taking out his anger on the homeless people of Manhattan. We suspect that the only reason it appears on the list at all is because of the provocative cover and the accompanying advertisements. The film hadn't generated a single hint of controversy when it had run in the US cinemas a few years earlier under the movie of a more subtle and stylish movie poster. The DPP list also contained a small number of unusual sections, which were later considered by many to be cinematic classics, including George A. Romero's 1968 debut Night of the Living Dead and John Carpenter's 1982 sci-fi horror The Thing, which had been shown uncut in UK cinemas just a couple of years earlier. Perhaps the most bizarre inclusion of all was Sam Raimi's original The Evil Dead movie from 1981, which later spawned a long-running media franchise. While it was packed with infamous over-the-top gory scenes, it was also a pretty campy and slapstick movie, which often appeared to be poking fun at the horror genre. It's not the full-blown, unapologetic horror comedy of the sequel Evil Dead 2, but it still came packaged with a playful wink. The truly bonkers thing here is that the original Evil Dead was still showing in some British cinemas after it had been passed by the British Board of Film Censors, so the Greater Manchester Police were often raiding video stores and seizing copies of a film that was being legally shown in cinemas just around the corner. In their defence, the police claimed that they were under the completely false impression that the cinema cut was a heavily edited version of the uncensored edition released on home video. There were no convictions to be squeezed from the seizing of the Evil Dead tapes, though. The distributors Palace Pictures fought tooth and nail in court in their argument that the film should never have been slapped on the ban list, and the jury agreed that The Evil Dead was not obscene. But it does make you wonder how much thought and research went into compiling the DPP list. It appears that some videos made the list purely because of the packaging, the title, a wrong assumption, a mix-up, or simply because it reached the point where any non-British horror title immediately became a contender. One unexpected side effect of the DPP list was that it whetted public appetite to actually watch all these forbidden new films that we weren't meant to be allowed to watch. If you were a fan of exotic and unusual horror titles, the Director of Public Prosecutions had very thoughtfully curated a collector's list of all the juicy ones, and the race was now on to tick them all off your bucket list of must-see films. This new surge in demand, created by the DPP list, obviously couldn't be legally met by video stores, but it did lead to the growth of underground piracy networks in which these banned films were copied and passed around in secret. It's likely that the sound and picture quality of the tapes would be pretty lousy if you were watching a fifth-generation copy, but trying to make sense of the glitchy gloom was all part of the experience, and it was still enough to send a tantalising shiver down the spine. Still, it wasn't so much fun for the out-of-pocket distributors and video vendors who were now getting put in the dock if they dared to supply any of the banned tapes in public. Approximately 3,000 prosecutions were initiated during this period, although only 100 of these actually led to convictions. On the whole, it was the distributors rather than the vendors who faced the highest risk of prosecution, although the vendors did occasionally cop for it, including 2 Stourbridge video dealers who were given suspended prison sentences for continuing to stock films on the banned list. Suspended prison sentences, hefty fines, and business closures were usually the maximum sentences imposed on those found guilty of supplying officially obscene material, but there was one notably high-profile case which resulted in prison time. David Hamilton Grant was something of a minor celebrity on the Soho scene, having gained fame as a porn producer during the 1960s and 70s. By the early 80s, he'd launched the distribution label World of Video 2000, but the label ran into serious trouble in early 1984 when it was found that they were continuing to distribute copies of a film that had appeared on the DPP list. In this case, it was the brilliantly titled 1981 psychological slasher Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, which told the story of a mentally deranged man who's released from a psychiatric hospital and embarks upon a surreal road trip with the ultimate intention of murdering his ex-wife and young child. David Hamilton Grant and 2 other label executives were found guilty of being in possession of over 200 copies of an obscene article for publication for Grant, and Hamilton Grant was originally sentenced to 18 months in prison. He only served 6 months in the end, by which time the distribution label had been placed into liquidation. The Guardian film critic Derek Malcolm had provided testimony in court, during which he ventured the opinion that the film was not a classic, but well executed. Derek Malcolm later revealed that he was disturbed by the response from the judge. So was the German invasion of Poland. Although I must say, I think that was quite an amusing quip from the judge. Nonetheless, looking at the expanded edition of Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, which is actually available to buy on Blu-ray today and is billed as the most complete version ever assembled, you might agree that it's a bit grisly and sinister, but now it seems almost inexplicable that it led to a man serving 6 months in prison. Whilst these successful prosecutions were celebrated by the National Viewers and Listeners Association, it was still felt that the Obscene Publications Act was not the most efficient method of tackling an unregulated industry. Perhaps sensing the blood-stained writing on the wall, the British Videogram Association began feverishly working on plans for self-regulation in 1983. But this appeared to get thrown out of the window when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher made her feelings clear. It is not enough to have voluntary legislation. We must bring in a law to regulate the matter. There must be no place in Britain for the video nasty. Graham Bright, the Conservative MP and friend of Mary Whitehouse, was right on the case. Towards the end of 1983, he introduced a private member's bill that would ultimately be passed with barely any vocal objections as the Video Recordings Act 1984. The matter had now been taken entirely out of the hands of the industry. The new Act of Parliament, real Parliament this time, declared that any commercial recording offered for sale or hire in the UK must carry a classification agreed upon by an authority designated by the Home Office. That designated authority was, of course, the British Board of Film Censors, headed up by James Furman, an organisation which would be rebranded as the British Board of Film Classification in 1984. From now on, every video had to be vetted by the BBFC before it was allowed onto the market, and it would be a criminal offence to supply any video without certification. This included older video releases, which would now only be allowed back onto the shelves after they were awarded a new certification. We're still not sure what the dogs had to say about this, or whether Graham Bright's research into the effect of video nasties on dogs yielded any results worth saying, but again, it's remarkable how very few people voiced any opposition to what was a pretty powerful new piece of legislation which took control from the viewer over what they were allowed to watch on video and placed that responsibility into the hands of a small board of censors. One MP who did bother to speak out against this new censorship was Labour's Austin Mitchell, who compared the measure to taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I'm worried that with the BBFC coming closer under the Home Office's control, censorship could become much stricter. Perhaps the new Video Recordings Act was just the kind of thing that George Orwell had in mind when he wrote his dystopian novel 1984. But there must have been some truth in the predictions of Austin Mitchell, as the BBFC, under James Furman's guardianship, did appear in some ways to take a stricter approach to video certification than the board had previously taken to film certification. Before Furman took control in 1975, the board had passed the incredibly violent psychological thriller Straw Dogs for an uncut cinema release in 1971. Yet, it was denied a home video release under the new Video Recordings Act and wouldn't see the light of day again in the UK until 2002. Many other films that had been seen in all their uncut glory at the cinema were only granted a home video certification after drastic cuts had been made. It was a slightly different story for the 1973 supernatural horror The Exorcist, the first horror film to receive a nomination for an Academy Award. Although this had enjoyed a cinema release in the UK and had been made available on video during the early unregulated years, Warner Bros. Made the decision to not even submit it to the BBFC for certification under the introduction of the 1984 Video Recordings Act. Although no official explanation was given, it seems likely that Warner Bros. Felt that The Exorcist had no chance of passing the stricter codes for video releases, and they didn't fancy the thought of The Exorcist receiving an official ban in the UK. It would eventually resurface on home media, but not until 1999. Anti-censorship warriors now look back at all this and ponder over how this new supposedly stricter form of censorship was allowed to get passed through Parliament so quickly and easily, and why James Furman and a small group of censors get to decide exactly what adults are allowed to watch. A few would argue that the video industry wasn't in urgent need of some kind of regulation, as, let's remember, it had been perfectly legal for children to rent an entirely inappropriate video that had been denied an 18 certificate at the cinema. But now, adults were being told by the censors that they weren't allowed to watch videos which they'd already seen in cinemas over a decade ago. Why should James Furman be entrusted with that kind of decision, and could it be that he was prone to making the wrong calls? His long tenure as the director of the BBFC between 1975 and 1999 was certainly a divisive one, and he appeared to attract criticism from both ends of the censorship spectrum. The Daily Mail ran an anti-BBFC campaign in the 1990s in opposition to what they perceived to be Furman's excessive liberalisation of the board. Mary Whitehouse also believed that he was far too lenient in passing films and videos for release. Furman himself would probably have thought himself as a bit of a liberal, particularly in the latter years of his tenure. He often argued that the board needed to reflect shifting public opinion and tastes, and that there was a greater need to understand the context of movies rather than just slapping bans on anything that felt a bit extreme. His decision to grant cinema certifications to the likes of Crash, Natural Born Killers and Reservoir Dogs in the 1990s did not go down well at all with Daily Mail readers. Yet it was confusing how he adopted a much stricter approach to the home video market, often insisting on extensive cuts or even denying a certificate altogether to films that had been shown uncut in cinemas. His official reasoning here was that there was less control over the audience in a home environment, whereas a curious kid would face a few obstacles in trying to get inside a cinema to watch an adult film. They would find it much easier to sneakily watch an adult videocassette at home whilst their rubbish parents were busy burgling the neighbours. So again, it appeared to hinge on shielding the children from explicit content. But we also get a little insight into the mindset of James Furman from a comment he made during a BFI screening of the 1974 classic The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which had been denied a cinema certificate in the UK and later made it onto Section 1 of the DPP list following successful prosecution of distributors and vendors. At one point during the BFI screening, Furman turned to one of his associates and remarked,
"It's alright for you middle-class cineastes to see this film, but what would happen if a factory worker in Manchester happened to see it?"
So, with that comment, we can see that Mr. Furman was keeping a close eye on the adults, not just the children, or at least the working class adults who needed to be guided by wiser and better educated citizens. And it's little wonder that this kind of thinking led to the belief that perfectly legitimate material was being banned by middle class toffs who felt that it would be dangerous for the scruffy oiks to watch anything that involved a chainsaw. The guidelines certainly felt a lot more relaxed after Furman's departure in 1999. It's surely no coincidence that this was the very same year in which The Exorcist, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Possession were all released uncut on video for the first time. And in fact, many of the movies that appeared on that infamous DPP list of banned video nasties have been released on home media ever since. Not quite all of them though. Some of them, particularly the Nazi sexploitation films such as the indefensible Gestapo's Last Orgy, are unlikely to receive any kind of official release, as the depicted sadistic torture and sexual assaults are widely considered to be genuinely nasty with no artistic merit whatsoever. SS Experiment Camp often gets lumped into the same genre, but this was released uncut on DVD in 2006, and that's because there's a big difference. The sexual activity depicted in this film might be weird, but it is consensual. The BBFC considered this one to be tasteless, but not bad enough to be refused certification. Other films from the list remain unavailable today, not because of any censorship issues, but simply because they were so obscure or so utterly terrible that no distributor has ever bothered to take any interest in them. Some of the more controversial films on the list are only available in slightly edited form. The 1978 Mondo horror film Faces of Death is a particularly strange one, as it presents itself as a documentary examining real-life extreme deaths, fatal accidents, and cannibalism in macabre detail. In truth, about 40% of the footage, including all the really gruesome stuff and the cannibalism, is faked, but the film does include pre-existing footage of genuine deaths, human suffering, and animal cruelty. It's the latter point that is still the most problematic today. Whilst Faces of Death is available on home media and still includes the real-life accidental deaths dished up for your entertainment, the scenes of animal cruelty have been removed. On the whole, it's depictions of genuine animal cruelty or prolonged sexual assault scenes that have been trimmed from the formerly banned titles now widely available, including Cannibal Holocaust and I Spit on Your Grave. Meanwhile, a big bunch of former video nasties are available today in their original uncut form and often in fancy collector's editions, including The Evil Dead, Last House on the Left, and Driller Killer. We're clearly a lot more chilled out these days than we were back in the 1980s. Relatively recent titles such as Saw, Hostel, and Human Centipede include more torture and depravity than anything ever seen on the video nasty list, but they were passed by the BBFC with barely a quibble. In fact, many of the supposed video nasties now seem quite laughably tame in comparison. So was the whole censorship panic just a load of old frightful fuss over nothing? Well, by the 1980s, the Daily Express had hailed the implementation of the 1984 Video Recordings Act as an unequivocal success, which had finally put a stop to children accessing harmful content and growing up to become violent criminals. But whilst video nasties had copped the blame for the growing crime rates in the UK, it's funny how all crime didn't immediately stop after 1984. On the contrary, crime rates continued to increase until the early 1990s. It's almost as if these films had nothing at all to do with growing crime rates in the first place. Even long after 1984, horror films continued to shoulder the blame for inspiring criminal acts, most notably the murder of the toddler James Bulger in 1993 by two 10-year-old boys. Much was made of the fact that a rented copy of the slasher film Child's Play 3 had been found at the house of the father of James Venables one of the young killers. The link was tenuous, to say the least, and it's hard to see how the film could have inspired the murder. Venables had always expressed a dislike of horror films, and he wasn't even living with his father at the time anyway, but this did nothing to stem the furious tide of another media protest about the effect of violent videos. And in the aftermath of the death of James Bulger, the whole Child's Play trilogy was voluntarily removed from the shelves of major retailers, whilst further changes were made to the 1984 Video Recordings Act to prevent the release of videos which could specifically encourage children to engage in harmful behaviour. This is despite the fact that there was literally no evidence of any kind of connection between Child's Play 3 and the murder of James Bulger. Incidentally, on a lighter note, a quite embarrassing blooper was discovered by the government in 2009. The 1984 Video Recordings Act had been legally unenforceable for the last 25 years. A crucial part of implementing the legislation involved notifying the European Commission first, but nobody had remembered to do this, meaning that the Act had been completely invalid for all this time. This revelation opened up a very brief window of time in which any retailer could technically have sold uncertified videos or games with no legal repercussions whatsoever, but most sensible retailers wisely agreed not to. Any pending prosecutions under the Act were abandoned, but the government decided that thousands of earlier convictions would still be upheld, and 2 appeals were later dismissed by the courts. The reasoning here was that the perpetrators had still willfully indulged in what they believed to be illegal activity, and these convictions shouldn't be quashed because of an oversight in legislation. Another factor is that it would have involved quashing the convictions of thousands of people, and nobody was in the mood for doing that. The government gained fast-track approval from the European Commission to rectify the Act, which has been legally enforceable since 2010, as far as we know. But we're still left bothered by what exactly ignited the censorship panic in the first place, and whether the consequences were entirely fair and justified. Video junkies of the early 1980s recall a glorious golden era during which their eyes were opened to a whole new library of exotic international material, and a typical trip to the video store involved browsing through intriguing, obscure, and tantalizing video covers that practically dripped blood. They felt that this wonderful new wild frontier of VCR was burned to the ground by Mary Whitehouse, Graham Bright, the Daily Mail, and lots of other people who didn't have the faintest clue what they were talking about. Following the 1984 Act, many independent distributors were forced out of business as they simply couldn't afford the expensive process of submitting every film to the BBFC for certification. And even after the major distributors finally got fully on board with video, the landscape of the video rental store was never quite the same again. Instead of nipping into the corner shop to rent a copy of The Beast in Heat or Invasion of the Blood Farmers, you'd be far more likely to nip into a big branch of Blockbuster to grab some popcorn and rent a copy of Top Gun or Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Before we get too wound up about censorship though, it's worth making the point again that something did have to be done about an entirely unregulated video industry in which young kids could legally rent adult films. But if we'd been able to deal with this issue in a much calmer environment, then maybe the government would have felt more inclined to let the industry have a go at sensible self-regulation. Instead, during the height of a panic, they handed over all the authority to a stuffy board left by a man who felt that factory workers in Manchester needed protection from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was a panic whipped up by a small group of moral crusaders who freely admitted that they'd never seen the films themselves. As the writer and film critic Ken Newman puts it,
"It's a low-cost moral stand to condemn something you have no interest in."
Mary Whitehouse and her campaigning buddies appeared to be going entirely on the titles and the cover artwork rather than the content. And the same is true of the police, who were raiding stores all across the UK and seizing copies of Dolly Parton musicals. The whole time, the press were fanning the flames of the panic and pushed forward the evidence of a rushed and deeply flawed report. And in response to all this, a Conservative government seeking re-election pounced on the idea that these foreign films were wholly responsible for corrupting the nation and rushed through legally unenforceable legislation to show voters that they were getting tough on the root causes of crime. It all serves as a stark reminder of just how quickly things can spiral out of control, and how it's not entirely inconceivable that sometime in the future another form of censorship panic could erupt in the UK with alarming repercussions given the right circumstances. But we will say one thing for Mary Whitehouse. She certainly helped bring many of these films to wider attention. It's likely that most of the films on the DPP list would have been destined to drift into eternal obscurity, but instead, they've now been forever immortalised in a hand-picked list of controversial titles that horror fans old and new are still itching to watch today. In many ways, she's probably done more for the genre than anybody else in history. In that sense, we'd like to believe that this should be regarded as her true legacy, even if she might be totally repulsed by that idea. Nonetheless, let's finish with 3 screams for Mary Whitehouse. the unsung queen of the video nasty.